Sunday, August 30th. This is my Sunday school class for those who are just getting an alert. I'm going live. It's it's just my Sunday school class. We're in the book of Genesis, and thank you those of you who have been consistently listening. It's amazing to me um, that you would take the time, but thank you. That's fantastic. Let us recap. Um, we're about to bring the flood. And so in Genesis chapter 5, verse 29, uh, Noah's daddy was Lamech. And it says that he had a son, and he called his name Noah, which means rest. Noah means rest. And here's why he named him. Well, he felt led by God to uh, call him Noah. Here's what he thought. Here's his interpretation of what God was doing. He says, this one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. So when they left the Garden of Eden, God cursed the ground and said, you're going to have to really work. It's going to be hard. Where before it, you just stayed in the Garden of Eden, there was fruit, there's all this stuff available to you. But now that you are no longer cooperating with me and you're making yourselves your own gods and you're making your own decisions, you're going to have a hard time with the land. So he says, I'm going to call him Noah. I feel like calling him rest. And here's what I think is going to happen. He's going to bring that peace between us and God as far as how hard we have to work on the ground. So that was what he thought, why he thought God was leading him to call him rest. So we'll discover why Noah's name was Rest, because it seems contradictory to what happened. Because Noah basically was preaching this warning, God's going to bring wrath. So I don't know why. Well, so at first reading, it's hard to determine why you would call that person Rest. Um, so in Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, this is where we left off. It says that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, because there had been two sets of people, those people who'd been following God and those people who'd been deciding to make themselves gods and were following their rule and how they felt things should be set up. But at a certain point, they all merged, and the sons of God, which are the good people, came and they saw the daughters of men, which were the bad people, the Sharks and the Jets, and then they mated, and now there's no distinction between the two, and everybody's crazy. In fact, there's only one man that was actually trying to follow after God, and that was Noah. So Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This word grace, the first time we see it in Scripture, and it means God's favor. He was favored. Now you would think he found mercy, like God's about to pour down wrath, because mercy means God does not give us what we deserve. He's merciful. We deserve wrath. Like, you do something stupid. Boy, you should have broke your leg. But that didn't happen. God was merciful, right? So you would think that he would say, well, Noah found mercy because he didn't suffer wrath like everybody else. But instead it says he found grace. And that's because of his obedience. Because Noah actually didn't deserve God's wrath. He was the one that actually was listening to God. He was the only person who's trying to figure out what is God's will? What does God want? And so, because of his obedience, he found grace. God gave him a ministry and gave him a mission. And so, that grace is what God gives us because of what Christ did. Grace is what God gives us at this point. At this point in the Torah, it wasn't because of what Christ did, but grace is what God gives us. Mercy is what God doesn't give us, right? He doesn't give us wrath. He doesn't give us punishment. So because of Noah's obedience, he found grace. In fact, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7 says, by faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet. So that's kind of interesting. So he had to take it by faith because God says, you're not going to flood the earth. And Noah's like, what's flood? What could that be? He moved with fear, moved with an awesome desire to follow God. This isn't a kind of, this word translated fear is not a dread like, oh no, Wow, like that awesomeness, we follow someone because we think they're so awesome. He moved with that awesome wonder, and he prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world. So his actions condemned the world because it was possible to follow God. Now, we can make an argument before God and say, well, no one was doing it. Everybody was messing. No, some people weren't. And like Noah. So by his actions, he condemned the world. Like, so it was possible at that time to follow God. He just wasn't. Everybody wasn't doing it, and he became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. And faith is not us coming up with something, telling God about it, and then believing God's going to do it for us. Faith is when we obey God. So faith has been mischaracterized in the last half a century as our attempt to just, you got to hold it. You decide on something that you want and you just believe God for it. You believe and you no, faith is much more simple than that. Faith is just our obedience to what God has put in our heart. God is telling us to do something, or God is telling us something that He's going to do. And faith means we believe Him. We're obeying Him. God says, I want you to go do that. And even though we don't know the outcome, we don't know the results, we are obeying Him by faith. And so it's always been that in the Bible. God always comes to people and tells them what He's going to do. People didn't go to God and tell them what they wanted Him to do. God, I want you to go to the supermarket and pick up a whole bunch of stuff for me and deliver it by 8 a.m. Instead, because we have a new group that does that. Hallelujah. But instead, faith is when God tells us what He's going to do and we believe Him. So that's what Noah did. He believed God. No one else believed God. Ain't no, that don't make no sense. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, God says to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Now, I want you to know that God is not deciding, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and judge the earth. He's created a principle that he's got to follow. He's created a law like if I put something, we live on the third floor. And if I put something on our little balcony rail there, and my wife said, "Don't put that there; it's going to fall over." And she kept warning me and kept warning me and kept warning me, it's going to fall over. And then, of course, the wind comes and knocks it, and it falls over. So gravity is not angry at the base that I put on there. It's not. It's not. Oh, I've just had it up to here. There's a law in motion, and if you knock something over, it's going to fall and hit. And when God says the end of all flesh has come before me, that he is patient, 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 and then at a certain point it's going to hit. It's just going to hit. He's just put that law. The sin becomes so great that God must now respond. And when you put that paper close to the fire and it's close to the fire, close to, okay, you're going to burn that up. Finally, the fire doesn't suddenly say, I'm so mad at that paper. It's been teasing me. I think I'm going to burn it. There's a law that's in place. And so once you get too close to the fire, it's just going to burn it up because you just kept getting closer, 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 and now splat, right? In Exodus chapter 3, verse 9, see, fire's going to do fire, and God's going to do God at a certain point. He can't help it. So now, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. And I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptian has oppressed them. This is Exodus chapter 3, verse 9. They had been there in Egypt, even though God had warned them not to go, and we'll get there later. But they had cried out to God, and the Egyptians just kept oppressing them, and said, okay, now it is finally, I'm full now. And so now I have to move. I have no choice. Fire has no choice. I must burn up that paper. You threw it in here. I got to do what I got to do. And in the case of delivering the children of Egypt, he says, now I've got to judge the Egyptians now, because he's so patient. He's so patient and long suffering. But at a certain point, he's full. He's just full. The cup runs over. There's nothing. You kept filling it, and at a certain point it runs over. In Amos chapter 8, verse 2, God says to him, Amos, what do you see? And so Amos says, so I said, a basket of summer fruit. Now, basket of summer fruit means that it's totally ripe now. It's totally ripe. It's time to eat. It's reached its ripeness. Then the Lord said to me, well, the end has come upon my people Israel, because he's shown a vision of the basket of summer fruit. In the spring, when it first a little bud, you can't eat it. And then as it's growing, but at a certain point, now it's ripe. and it's time to eat. And it's going to fall off the tree because it's ripe. Now there's a time when, okay, time's up. So when he says that the end of all flesh has come before me, it's like I've given them space, given them space, given them space, and now it's time. Now it's time. So in Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, he says, make an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. Cover it so that the water can't get in. Now, this term ark, Noah didn't know what it was. There had never been an ark. There had never been a reason for an ark. Remember that there was a canopy of water above the earth, like a greenhouse, but the plants were watered from the water below the earth would come up and water, and it was really rich, the water that would come and water the plants, but it would come up from beneath and water them. But there had never been rain yet. That hadn't happened yet. So he's asking him to build an ark. That takes a lot of faith. This word ark is not used again until Exodus. Here's the time when it was used. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, it says, Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Because Pharaoh was getting nervous because they were oppressing the people of Israel. He knew in his heart there was going to come an uprising at a certain point. And so he's trying to avoid it. And so he's saying, take every male child and throw them in the river. Casting them in the rivers, that's a type of death. But in Exodus chapter 2, verse 3, Moses' big sister was out there, and his mother says that when she could no longer hide him, because she'd given birth to Moses, and by commandment, she was supposed to throw him in the river. That river is a type of death, right? And she took for him an ark. So this is the second time this word ark comes up in the Bible, of bulrushes, and dubbed it with slime and with pitch. She covered it with pitch in and out, just like the ark that Noah was supposed to build, with slime and pitch, and he put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And it's the same image of Noah in the ark. It's the same image of Moses in that ark that they created for him. It's the water is death, but if you're in the ark, then you're saved. In your ark, you are rescued. And so Moses was rescued from that same horrible fate that was supposed to befall all those other male Jewish children, right? And so Noah is in the ark, and God's created this ark. It's the thing that he creates for our safety. If we're in the ark, we're good. If we're outside the ark, then the water covers us, and that water is a type of death. In Exodus chapter 25, verse 21, there's another time they mention the ark. He says, thou shalt put the mercy seat above the ark. And so God took, and there's a reason why it's called the mercy seat, because man had failed on 3 different occasions to listen to God, and his mercy was protecting them from the wrath that should come. Thou shalt put the mercy seat above the ark, and in the ark thou shalt put the testimony that I shall give thee. Remember, in the ark, they put the rod that budded, he put the 10 commandments, and he put that pot of manna. So that represented 3 occasions where they didn't believe God's direction and who he had chosen to lead them. And so they challenged God. Why are you picking Aaron? Who do you think you are, God? Well, who do you think you are, Moses? And so we don't believe you. So God said, everybody put down your rod, and the one that buds, that'll prove to you overnight, when suddenly a flower grows from it, you'll know that that's the person I have chosen. And so that's when they were challenging God. They were challenging Moses, but basically they were challenging God, like, you don't know what you're doing. The 10 Commandments, obviously God had said, come to me, come to Mount Sinai. And they said, nah, Moses, you go talk to God. We're going to go do our old thing and build a calf. And that the 10 Commandments was God's mercy. Like, here's what I'm giving you. If you do all this stuff, I won't judge you. I won't have to judge you. If you just not kill and steal, but if you act like you want to act, I'm going to eventually have it up to here, and I'll have to blow you up. Also, the manna, they didn't trust God, and so that was a sign of they don't trust God's provision. So the 10 Commandments, they didn't trust God's moral concept of how the world should run. But we don't think you're going to provide for us, and so he brought manna. That was God's mercy. He could have judged them, but that was God's mercy. Instead of judging you, I'm going to go ahead and provide for you, even though you don't believe me. It's 3 things in an ark, and then cover it with the mercy seat. And And that's a sign of God's protection. Everything outside of God's protection will eventually be judged. But if we're inside the ark, whether it's an ark of Noah, that ark that Moses was in, or the ark of the covenant, then we're protected. So he says, build an ark, Genesis chapter 6, verse 15 through 17. And this is how you'll make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits. Now, cubit is about 18 inches. It's supposed to be from the elbow to the tip of the finger. And that's how, and you know, they were all about the same height. So that's how they would measure things. And that was a cubit, about 18 inches. So he's talking about something that's about 450 feet, which would be like a football field is 300 feet, and then the end zones and up into the stands. He basically is describing a football stadium because it's 3 stories high, and it's about the shape kind of a football stadium that he's asking him to build this thing, 350 feet long. And he says its width is going to be 50 cubits, which is about 75 feet wide. So it's skinny like that. You know, like, of course, some stadiums, they make them crazy. They're just too big. But, you know, if you can imagine a football field and the seats around it, and its height is 30 cubits, which is about 3 stories high, maybe about 45 feet high, which is about 3 stories. And you shall make a window in the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above. Like, just put that window at the very top, like 18 inches from the very top, and then set the door of the ark on its side, and you shall make it with a lower, second, and third deck. So make it 3 stories high. And behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth. It's like flood waters on the earth. What, I don't know what that is, because we've never seen it rain, to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. The water is that type of death. That water is that type of death. Like the children being thrown into the river, the male children, that represents death. First Peter gives us the image in First Peter chapter 3, verse 19 through 21. He says, when Jesus had died, he went to prison, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits who were in prison. These are people like Moses, like Noah, who had died. He had gone to heaven. They were in like a prison. Prison is probably a bad word, but they were in confinement. And then Jesus went first and preached to them and said, I am that Messiah that you've been waiting for. I am that person that you've been believing, that who's going to come, that seed that had been promised starting with Eve. I am him. And so they said, which sometimes were disobedient, that they didn't always act right, but they basically believed. And once the long suffering of God waited, once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. So they were kind of in a prison. We're going to look at how long they were in that, waiting for God to finally release them. So once Noah and them got into the ark, they waited a long time for God to ultimately free them. We talk about 40 days and 40 nights, and we think at the end of 40 days it was all done. But it was a long time that they were in that ark, and just waiting for God to give them the signal, okay, now you're free. And he's saying the same thing when Jesus went and preached to those people, those patriarchs, all throughout the Old Testament, who had trusted God. They were waiting until they were finally free. And then he finally led captivity captive, it says, and took them to heaven. He says, the like figure, here's important in verse 22 of 1 Peter chapter 3, the like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. Baptism is a type of death. We are put in the water as a type of our death. The water represents death, and then we come out. Finally, when God releases us, we're supposed to be brand new. Now he says, it's not the putting away the filth of the flesh. It's not that baptism is cleansing our outside, but it's a type of death. But it's the answer of a good conscience towards God. We now are trusting God. And so by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So he's saying, just like Noah was in that ark, he says the world is being baptized. And that's what baptism is, that like figure. That's what he's trying to, God is teaching us lessons from the very beginning. He's painting pictures for us, and he repeats himself over and over and over and again throughout the Bible. He teaches the same lessons so that we can understand his grace, understand his mercy, understand his salvation. So he says, even the ark is just a type of baptism. Baptizing the earth, he's drowning the earth, and he's washing away sin, and then he's bringing forth that new creation. When the doors of the ark open and Noah comes out, they're coming out to a new creation. He says the same thing. That's why we're baptized, so that we can understand You're dying to all that old stuff. All that old sin is being washed away. And when you come out of the water, you're brand new. Okay, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 18, it says, go into the ark, but I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. So when you come out, we will establish a covenant. So I'm going to operate a little differently, where I was letting man just kind of make their own decisions, but I'm going to make a covenant. And so we'll discuss what that covenant was he made with Noah. And so Genesis chapter 6, verse 19 through 20. It says, and we're all familiar with this part. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will you come to you to keep them alive. So he lists birds first, then the animals, then the creeping things. He does it in that order because that's the order in which he had created them. Remember in Genesis chapter 1, verse 22, God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and let fowls multiply in the earth. So he created birds first. And then in chapter 24, he says, let the God bring forth a living creature of his kind, cattle, and then creeping things, and the beasts of the earth after its kind, and it was so. So that's the order that he created: birds, then the cattle, and then the creeping thing. For my taste, he could have left the creeping things off, but that's okay. He created it and it's good, but I don't need the creeping thing. So he says, when you bring him into the ark, bring him in that same order. Bring in the birds, then the cattle, then the creeping things. And Genesis chapter 6, verse 21 says, and you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. So bring enough food. You're going to bring in food. They weren't supposed to eat the animals that were in the ark. Whoops. Don't bring in no pig. So he says, bring in food. Take for yourself of all food that is eaten. So everything you're going to eat, take it in for yourself, and you shall gather it, that food, to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them animals. So bring that into the ark. Some people think that, well, here's why they think that Noah ate some of the animals that were in the ark. I'll tell you why in a second. But he didn't. He says, bring in food so that, because the whole point was to preserve them, not to bring them in and eat them up. He come out and say, oh, dang, we ain't got no cattle. So in Genesis chapter 6, verse 22, it says, thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did. So now God gets more specific in chapter 7. So Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8, he's just kind of repeating the same instructions, but he's getting more specific as he repeats them. So he's more specific. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 2, he says, of every clean beast, so he's dividing them into clean beast and dirty beast. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and the beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and the female. So he's saying, I want you to bring 7 beasts that are clean, but just 2, a male and female, of the unclean. So God's saying, I look out for the clean and the unclean. Hallelujah. Thank goodness he does do that. So I look out for the clean and the unclean. But of the clean, I want you to bring 7. So a male, a female, male, a female, male, a female, and then an extra male. And there was a reason for that. Okay. And but of the unclean, those are the ones that I just wanted to bring 2, just 1 male and female of each kind. Okay. So people think, oh, he brought 6 of those. He brought extra clean because they were going to eat the clean ones and end up with just 2. But he'd already said, bring food for yourself and for them. So that's not why he wanted to bring extra the clean animals. But we'll look at that why in just a minute. So verse 6. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters was upon the earth. So Noah went in, verse 7 of Genesis chapter 7, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood. In verse 9, there went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah. So they're in the ark. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. Now, here's an interesting thing. And this is so typical God. They went into the ark and nothing happened for 7 days. So don't they feel stupid? So Noah's been preaching. So first of all, they're building the ark on land. They're not building it out in the ocean. They're building an ark on land. Why are you building a boat in the middle of this park here. And it's going to rain. What's rain? Just trust me. God's going to judge. And Noah preached for about 100 years while he's building this ark, because it took a long time to build the ark. He had never built an ark. No one had built one before. Good thing he didn't ask me to do it, because even with instructions, I don't understand. Press what button? So he's giving him instructions. He's building this ark. There's no rain. Then this family goes in. Ha 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 ha. We're going into the ark, and they're there for 7 days. Didn't you say it was going to rain? We're just sitting in this ark. What's going on? There's some daughter-in-laws that were not happy. Girl, I could have been at a party. So
Never should have married you.
I never said, oh, your daddy crazy. So they're in the ark for 7 days. Nothing's happening. So, and here's when it happened. And that's what us to keep track. So Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. All hot. These animals are pooping. Okay. My wife.
I can't stand you.
Hey, ooh, that's why I should not have married you. Anyway, so they're just in an ark. 3 stories. Okay, so in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, so it's February, basically. I'll just call it February, right? It's the second month of their year, and when he's 600 years old. So when he's 500, when he started doing this, he's 600 now. 100 years he's been doing this. So it's the second month. It's February, the 17th day of the month, and on that day, finally, so they went in on the 10th of the month. On the 17th, it was 7 days, and God's all about 7 days. So I'm saying this because God will sometimes have you do something, and then nothing happens. But it doesn't mean that you because he just wants to see, do you really believe me or not? So sometimes there are not instant results. That doesn't mean that you're wrong. It doesn't mean God showed from the beginning. Oh, I'll just make you sit and wait for 7 days. So, but that doesn't mean that you're wrong. We can't look at the circumstances. We either have to trust God or not. But you can't look at the circumstances to determine whether God is true or whether you heard God. You just have to wait. So God's already given the principle of, I'll put you in the ark, and you still may have to wait, and it's okay. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. Had they come out the ark, and I know somebody wanted to come out this ark. Woo! You need to come out.
Door.
Open. You better. Well, see. So they're sitting in the ark. They went on the 10th. On the 17th day, that's when all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. So the water came from beneath them. It says, and then the windows of heaven were opened up. So finally, the water's coming up. And then it's starting to rain, and it had never rained. This canopy of water that had been the earth, above the earth, that was shielding them from the UV rays and all that stuff, and people's skin was all nice. Finally, the rain is coming. Okay, so Genesis chapter 7, verse 16 says, and they that went in, male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and then the Lord shut him in. Now, this is interesting because they use 2 names for God, and they keep alternating in this, and you could do a whole study on this. Elohim is the name of God, right? But Jehovah, Yahweh, is the name of the covenant God. He says, I'm going to reveal myself as the covenant God to you as Yahweh. We kind of talked about that earlier. So they used both names. They went in as God had commanded, but it was Yahweh who protected them and shut them in to make sure they were safe. So the covenant, Jehovah, and way later with Moses, after Abraham and all this, Moses says that God revealed himself to Abraham as Elohim, but he once the 10 Commandments came and they were revising the covenant, that he says, now I'm going to reveal myself to you as Jehovah. So Jehovah is the name of the covenant. I'm making the promise. The God of the promise is Jehovah. And so it's just interesting, this use, if you could kind of study it, when they called him, God did this, but Jehovah did this. God did this, but Jehovah did. It's the same person, but he's saying, because of the covenant, here's what I'm doing. So Jehovah shut them in. Now, finally, they're in the ark, and we know that it rained for 40 days, right? Everybody knows that part. But here's what's interesting. Genesis chapter 8, verse 3. And the waters receded continually from the earth. And at the end of 150 days, the waters finally started decreasing. So it rained for 40 days. So the rain stopped after 40 days, but it's still, like the bathtub is full. Like finally, after 150 more days of just being in this ark, now the waters finally start decreasing. And in verse 4 of chapter 8, Genesis chapter 8 says, then the ark rested in the 7th month and the 17th day of the month. So in the 2nd month, and 5 months later, finally the ark had been floating. You talk about seasick. It's been floating. It's finally resting on the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. Ararat is in where Armenia is, not Ararat, in that kind of area. And finally, they could feel the boat hit the top of a mountain, just the top. So they hadn't seen land for 5 months. And verse 5 says, and the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. So it's 3 more months. And in the 10th month, on the first of the month, the tops of the mountain were finally seen. So they couldn't see the top of the mountain. The boat just hit the top of a mountain and stopped, but they couldn't see it. So there's a part of the, boat that was obviously under the water. Finally, they could see the top of a mountain. So they hadn't seen land. They went in the 2nd month, and now it's the 10th month. Was that October? November, December. Yes. And so from February to October, they hadn't even seen land. So now finally, the top of a mountain. So Genesis chapter 8, verse 10. And he waited. So now he's trying to, so the water's still going. It's October, it's November, it's December, it's January. They're still waiting. And because, okay, so a little bit more of the mountain, they can see a little bit more. So that Moses sent out a raven. And the raven didn't come back because ravens don't need to come back because the ravens can exist on tops of mountains and in the wet. And, so the raven's like, I'm free. I'm getting out of this mug because those pigs keep farting. So it says he waited another 7 days. And again, so he sent the dove out and the dove came right back. So he waited 7 days. God had already established this 7-day thing. Remember, he made them wait for 7 days in the ark. On purpose, God made them wait 7 days. So Noah was used to now waiting 7 days. So he sent out a dove, and then he waited 7 days, like God had made him wait. And he sent the dove out from the ark. And in verse 11 of Genesis chapter 8, then the dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth. And Noah knew that the waters had really started to recede from the earth, because an olive tree can survive in water for a long time. Olive tree is very interesting. We're going to talk about this olive tree. Okay. And so he came back with this olive tree. Now, that becomes like this international sign of peace now, with the dove with the olive tree branch in her mouth. Why did the olive tree become to represent the sign of peace? So when you study ancient cultures, if somebody is planting olive trees, that means they plan on being somewhere for a long time, because it takes from between 5 to 12 years once you plant an olive tree to get the first little olive, just one olive. It takes 5 to 12 years. Anywhere in that time, the average is about 7 years just to get one olive. And before the whole tree is producing olives, it could be from 40 to 50 years. That's the average. It could be up to 85 years, but the average is between like 40 and 50 years before you're going to have a full olive. So if you're planting olive trees, you are planning to be somewhere for a long time. In ancient civilizations, they had to know that they were at peace with their neighbors before they would plant olive trees, because you were not going to get any return from it for years. So that it became a symbol of peace, because you knew you were gonna be in some region long enough to get some, because it's a waste of time to plant olive trees. That's not what you plant if you only going to be some for a little while. If you knew you were going to stay, and there are olive trees that are 1,500 years old, 2,000 years old, that are alive today, because olive trees, they last a long time, but it takes a long time before they really produce in any meaningful way to help a village. So it became a symbol of peace. They would send an olive branch to each other, because once this is signifying we're going to have peace for a long time in this region, once you had made peace with your neighbors. So the dove comes back with this olive in its mouth as a symbol of God's peace. You're going to be able to plant and be somewhere for a long time, Noah. You're going to be able to be there for a long time. So it's not a coincidence. He could have come back with any kind of branch, but God led that dove to that olive branch. Now, remember, the world has been baptized in water, and that water symbolizes that death, right? And then the dove comes back with the olive branch to let him know that it's now peace. When do we see that again in the Bible? Matthew chapter 3, verse 16. When Jesus had been baptized, Jesus came up immediately from the water. And behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting upon him. Not a coincidence, because the world is now going to be at peace. Here's this time for peace. And so just like God sent that dove to Noah, signifying, okay, you're going to be able to plant, I'm bringing you peace. When Jesus was baptized, which is symbolic of death, right? And then we're baptized, like Peter said, we're all baptized. A dove came, and God is just repetitious. You can tell that because he wants us to recognize him. So because people, how do I know if that's God? How do I know it's God? Read the Bible. Read the stories in the Bible, because God does the same thing over and over and over and over again, so that we'll know, oh, that's God. That's just like what happened to this people. That's just like what happened. That we don't have to be confused. If we make ourselves student of his word, which is what he asked us to do, to read it continually and stay in it, when things happen, we're able to recognize it, because, well, that's just like what happened with Joseph. That's just like what happened with David. And we can recognize his works because God's just not an original. I mean, he doesn't change. I'm the Lord, I change not. So, I mean, he doesn't keep doing crazy things like, oh, I can't tell what God is doing. He's not capricious. He repeats over and over. So the dove, when he came out of the water, the dove, Jesus. When Noah finally the boat comes out of the water, the dove. Okay, so Genesis chapter 8, verse 13 through 16. And it came to pass in the 601st year of the first month. So remember, when he was 600, in the second month, that's when the floods came. So now it has been almost a year. It came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month of the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. So it's the first month. He's looking around. It's been 11 months that they've been shut up in this ark. When he finally opened the top of it so they can look around, and goes, wow, it's dry. And what did Noah do? Nothing. He waited. Verse 14 says, and in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So Noah didn't get ahead of God. Even though they'd been in that ark, they wanted to get out that ark. If I don't find me a normal bathroom, there's going to be a problem. They had been in that ark for almost a year, but they still waited on God. They still waited on God. Noah, he could have looked around and said, well, here's our sign. Look, everything's dry, and the dove came back 2 months ago. And he said, but no, until God says move, I'm not moving. That's Noah's plus. That's Noah's like, I'm obedient to God. I'm not obedient to any other. I don't care what the circumstances say. I don't care what this say. If God doesn't say do it, I'm not going to do it. So he waited another month. And they could have left. They saw the ground was dry, but God didn't say. So finally, he says, now go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and your wives with you. So in Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, it says, then Noah built an altar to the Lord, to Jehovah. And again, they alternate in these 3 chapters between Elohim and Jehovah. They keep alternating. Now, after this time, they're going to only use Elohim for a long time as the name of God. They're not going to use Jehovah for a long time. But Noah built an altar to Jehovah, to Yahweh, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird. And that's why the clean animals and clean birds were brought into the ark, because they were going to start using them to make sacrifices to the Lord, because you can only sacrifice a clean animal to the Lord. Why? Because he's teaching us about the Messiah who's to come, who's going to be clean and perfect before the Lord. He's already teaching them there's a difference between the clean and the unclean. You want to head toward the clean, and the clean will be sacrificed for your sins ultimately. So he's already painting a picture of their salvation that is to come. So Noah establishes a covenant. He makes atonement. There's a thank offering. And now remember, there's 7 of them. So there's 2, 2, 2, and then 1. Not 7 couples. There's 7 total. And so there's an extra bird, and so that extra male animal was sacrificed, and then they begin to sacrifice these clean animals, and that's what they were for, so they can establish his covenant. And verse 21 says, and the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. So this is Noah saying, I'm pledging myself to you. We're going to start off brand new on this earth with a brand new covenant where we are listening to God. It's what Cain and Abel. Abel was trying to do. I had to say them in order. You know how your parents have to call your names in order for you to remember you. Abel was sacrificing to the Lord. They understood animal sacrifice back with Adam and Eve. And when Moses is writing the story, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the children of Israel who are reading it, they understand that sacrifice. They understand sacrifice. They're in the wilderness, and they're being taught what the sacrifice means. And God's saying, I want you to build a tabernacle, and I want you to sacrifice before me, and I want you to carry this ark before me, etc. And so they got it. Oh, that's a sign of the covenant. That's the sign of him establishing that, of Noah establishing covenant with God. And remember, God, I change not. It's man who went away. Man who said, I'm going to build my own city. I'm going to do my own thing. And now Noah's saying, no, we're going to start again. And I'm establishing our covenant with you. So in verse 21, it says, and the Lord smelled a soothing aroma, which is not necessarily, ooh, that meat smelled good, although I totally get that. But the aroma is really his obedience and his faith. Then Jehovah. So again, he built an altar to Jehovah, and the Jehovah received that obedience, that sweet smelling savor. It says, then Jehovah said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. Now, this is an interesting thing for him to say, because he had just said the opposite in Genesis chapter 6. He says, so here he's saying, I'm not going to curse the ground for man's sake, even though the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. In Genesis chapter 6, he had said the opposite. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, he says, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So that's the slight difference. He's saying he's evil from his youth. Like at a certain point, he just decides to be evil. Earlier, he said it's always evil, period. But it says because of that, in Genesis chapter 6, in the previous chapter, he says, so the Lord said, I will destroy man who I have created from the face of the earth, because I see how evil he is constantly. Because of that, and we're full, I've got to destroy him. Now he's saying, I will, even though he's evil all the time from his youth, I'm not going to do this anymore. So what changed? Did God change or did man change? Duh. So obviously man changed. So now because of this covenant, I now have permission to not bring this on you like I would have to if the covenant didn't exist. Once you've decided, Noah, to make this covenant with me and start that sacrifice, people had not been sacrificing to God. There had not been thank offerings and peace offerings and sin offerings. These are all these different type of offerings that we'll get into at some point. Once Moses explains all that, then I'll explain it. But these type of offerings that Noah was doing with these extra clean animals, that had been done in hundreds of years, where people were thanking God and recognizing God and giving him credit and putting their life in his hands and recognizing that they were sinners and saying, here's an offering for my sin. That had not been done because people are just ignoring God. They're not thanking God because they don't think God's responsible for anything. God didn't do this. I did this. They're not making peace with God because they don't think God's not mad at me. I don't even think there is a God. They weren't offering sin offerings because I'm not sinning. It's not a sin. Whatever I choose to do is right. And so Noah was reversing that and saying these offerings were going to give to him. And because they were doing that, God's saying, now I don't have to, there's a stopping point because that's what the offering is. And of course, Jesus ultimately became that stopping point so that it doesn't hit you. It's like when I knocked that thing off the balcony. I'm just making that up. I did not knock anything off the balcony. But it's like there was an umbrella that it lands on so it doesn't hit the ground, So because of that covenant, I don't have to bring that condemnation on you, that ultimate wrath. But it's for those in the ark. So we got to get in the ark because that rain represents the wrath that is coming for everybody. But water, we're baptized symbolically. We come out of the water and the dove, brings that olive branch to us. It's for those that are in the ark. Moses in that ark is saved from it. It's for us in the ark. Those who have that covenant with God, then we escape that punishment. But the punishment is still coming. But he's saying, I won't do this because of that covenant that I've established. And then at a certain point, though, God's going to put us back in that ark, and he's going to lift, we call that the rapture, at a certain point, and then wrath will finally come again, but not falling on, but we are the salt of the earth. We're that light. We're the salt that's preserving. You know, they use salt as a preservative, as we all know, and it would keep the meat from because they didn't have refrigerators and all that stuff, from spoiling. So they would just wrap it in that salt, and that salt would preserve it. And so as long as that salt is there, you keep the corruption from coming. At a certain point, that salt is going to be removed. But we are that light in the world that keeps the darkness away. You turn on the flashlight, you turn the light on, it keeps the darkness at bay. The dark, as soon as that light goes, the darkness is like, "Whoa, thank you." And the dark, but while that light's there, it keeps the darkness at bay, right? And that's what we are. So he says, because of this, that's keeping my wrath at bay. So Genesis chapter 8, I'm almost done. While earth remains, Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. So he's saying, how long is the covenant is going to last? While earth remains, while there's seed time and harvest. So while there's time when you plant the seed and then you harvest the seed. While there's cold and heat. While there's winter and summer. And day and night, they will not cease. So that's how long my covenant will last. As long as there's day and then night. Last night there was night, and now today there's day. So as long as that keeps happening, you don't have to worry about it. As long as there's heat and cold, some of us wish there was only cold. We need to get rid of this heat. But there's going to be heat, there's going to be cold. There's going to be winter, there's going to be summer, there's going to be seed time, there's going to be harvest. As long as that cycle is happening, as long as you see the sun and moon, then that's how long this covenant will last. But there's a day he's going to fold it all up and roll it all away. So, and we're that preservative until that time. So here's how God looks at it. In Isaiah chapter 54, verse 7 through 9, he says, for a small moment I have forsaken thee, but with great mercies I will gather thee. So there was a little bit of time, he's telling Israel, but with great mercies. So there was a small moment of forsaking, but great mercies I will gather thee. Verse 8 says, in a little wrath I hid my face from thee for just a moment, but with everlasting kindness I will have mercy on thee, saith the Lord thy Redeemer. So yeah, there's a moment of wrath. So God's looking at all of history and saying, yeah, that Noah thing, that was just a small moment of wrath. But the rest of the time from Noah till today, that's been all about my mercy. So yes, there was 40 days and nights of wrath, but then there's been 400,000 years of mercy. Verse 9 says, for this is as the waters of Noah unto me. So we're in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 7 through 9. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so I have sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. So that sort of thing was momentary. Or I was just quit that, you need to quit that. Okay, but the rest of the time it's all been mercy. It's been mercy because of that covenant that I established with Noah. Once Noah has reestablished that we recognize God. In 1 Kings chapter 8, because this is why Noah was called rest, because that was what was confusing at the very beginning of this lesson. Like, you're calling him rest, but all he did was preach about wrath coming, and there was wrath coming. Why is his name rest? In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 6, then verse 56, Solomon had just built the first temple. It says, and verse 6 says in 1 Kings chapter 8, then the priest brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place. So he brings the ark in to the temple. The ark, just like the Moses ark, like Moses' ark, the ark, that same ark, he brings it into its place, into the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place under the wings of the cherubim. And here's what Solomon said once they had completed this temple, where the people can come and offer their sacrifices to the Lord, where they can come and complete their covenant with the Lord and renew it. He says, blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, according to all that he promised. There has not failed one word of promise which he promised through his servant Moses. And so he's given Noah, he's given rest to his people because of this covenant. So Noah represented the rest that comes after the wrath, the rest that we're now in because of the covenant that we've established. So yes, Noah was to bring rest, not from the ground and its labor and all of that, as his father thought that, well, that's why we're calling him Noah. But because he brought that rest because that he reestablished that covenant with God. He's gonna reestablish a people, and if you follow, we're gonna follow the line of Noah and that people who are going to be that preservative. And there's going to be other tributaries who are not going to follow after God. But there, all he needs is that remnant. All God needs is that remnant, and he'll preserve them in his ark of rest. And so we want to be in that ark of rest and make sure we have that covenant established. As long as we're there, we're protected. The storms can come, the winds can come, the waves, but there's that ark that will rise above, and that's where we want to be, in that ark, in that rest. Praise be to God who gives us rest. And like Solomon said, there has not failed one word of all of his good promise, which he promised through his servant Moses. So everything that God has promised to us, it's still ours, but we get it through that covenant relationship. Okay, so thanks so much for tuning in. Next week, we deal with Moses' kids, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and what happened with them. It is fascinating to me because it's the story of the history. Because now the world's been remade, right? World's been remade, and so all the peoples of the earth come from those three kids, and we're going to just follow their migration pattern, where they went, what this means, the curse of Canaan, on and on and on and on. It's amazing. To me, it's fascinating. It's like one of my favorite things. So we'll talk about that next Sunday. I'll see some of you then. Also, I'll see you on Wednesday night Bible study at 7:00, where we're in the book of Matthew, and Jesus is just, well, it doesn't matter. I don't want to tell the whole thing. But for those of you members of Good Shepherd, please turn to our pastor. He'll be coming on around 11:00, and you can find him on his webpage, Pastor Renandus Grimm, and you can find him on the Good Shepherd page at 11:00. So thank you, and I will see you in a few days, or I'll see you next week. And let's see, okay, save that, then go to here in video.